Welcome back to our series on enterprise risk management. In our last session, we set the stage for the risk management process by defining the scope, context, and criteria for managing risk, basically the foundation for a risk assessment. Today, we're going to dive into the first step of the risk assessment process, which is the risk identification step. This is where we start to uncover specific uncertainties that could impact our illustrative iPhone division objective. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. To understand risk identification in a structured way, let's take a look at this risk assessment graphic featured in the COSO ERM framework. This graphic highlights the process, input, approaches, and output for each phase of the risk assessment. For the risk identification process, we start with the inputs. The inputs are the foundational elements we use to understand our objectives and the business environment, and then we end up with approaches, which are going to be our techniques to use systematically to identify the risk. Finally, we're going to have the outputs. The outputs are what we gain from the process, which is the starting point for assessing and managing risk. Both COSO and ISO 31000 emphasize that risk identification is more than just listing potential threats. Instead, it's about linking the relevant risks to our business objectives, understanding them in the context of our strategy, and then engaging the right stakeholders across an organization. For our Apple example, this means connecting the risk we identified directly to the revenue growth objective of 3 to 5%, and then considering how each risk could either hinder or help this objective. So let's start with the inputs. In the COSO graphic, we see elements that help us anchor our risk identification process to the business context, which is something we've covered in a previous lesson. For Apple's iPhone division, these inputs would include strategy and business objectives, which is our goal to achieve the 3 to 5% revenue growth. Then we're also going to have risk appetite and tolerance. This is going to be how much risk is Apple willing to accept to achieve this objective. For example, Apple might accept more risk in areas related to innovation, but less in regulatory compliance. Then we have business context. This includes both internal factors like Apple's resources and processes, and then external factors like consumer demand or economic conditions. Finally, we have a portfolio view of risk. This is the bigger picture, essentially how each risk fits within Apple's overall risk profile. But because we're only focusing on one objective today, we won't develop an entire portfolio view. By grounding our process in these inputs, we ensure that the risks we identify are relevant and connected to what Apple is trying to achieve. After incorporating our inputs, our next step is to use one or more of the identification approaches. Here, we're going to leverage the inputs to systematically uncover the risk associated with our objective. As you can see in the graphic, there are several approaches we could take. If we were to host a workshop and brainstorming session, we would gather cross-functional teams, such as the product development, marketing, and supply chain teams, to discuss potential risk. We may also want to check the associated documentation for a process analysis. Here, we would review the workflows and identify any inefficiencies that might introduce operational risk to our objective. We might even want to interview employees and suppliers to gather insights for risks that may not be immediately visible when we analyze the processes and workflows. Past performance data will also be helpful so we can learn about recurring risk or trends that might have developed in the past that could provide additional context. The identification inputs and approaches together produce an output referred to as a risk inventory. A risk inventory, in its most basic form, is a list of the relevant risks categorized by risk types, ownership, risk appetite, and severity. The risk inventory is our starting point for analyzing and then managing risk. Given our risk identification inputs, all coupled with the risk identification approach, here's an example of what you might expect to see from a risk inventory. Starting left to right, we would likely see the risk pillars we've set a risk appetite for in the previous lesson. Strategic risk would include any risks that could affect our goals, in particular, economic factors that could limit how much investment goes into, say, research and development for the iPhone. Customer and geographical risk would include risks that involve consumer behavior or market dynamics such as shifts in preferences for smartphone devices or just purchasing power. Operational risk would include talent, supply chain, and process-related risks that could impact the day-to-day operations for iPhone production and delivery. Compliance and regulatory risk would include obligations to legal and customer safety standards and regulations. For example, battery safety. Technology and innovation risks would include challenges that arise from the failure to innovate or adopt leading technologies that are standard in, say, smartphone competitors. Privacy risk would include any risk related to the iPhone data security and compliance with privacy regulations. Then finally, we have reputational risk. This would include any risk that would erode customer trust or damage Apple's brand. By grouping the risk pillars into categories and sources of risk tailored to the revenue objective, we ensure clarity at 3 levels. First, the risk pillar level, second, the risk category level, and third, the source of risk level. This grouping allows for accountability and alignment with Apple's risk appetite. So in the next lesson, we'll spend time analyzing these sources of risk, assessing their likelihood and impact to determine the risk severity level, and then putting it all together. Thank you for joining me today for lesson 3 of our risk management series. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.